The rain hammered down on the Belgian countryside as over 200,000 men prepared to settle the fate of Europe in a single day. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had dominated the continent for 2 decades, stood on one side. Against him, the combined might of Britain and Prussia, led by 2 of history's most formidable commanders. June 18, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo. And by sunset, the world would never be the same. What's up, history enthusiasts? And welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, make sure to smash that subscribe button, because today we're diving into one of the most pivotal battles in human history. We're talking about the Battle of Waterloo, the epic showdown that ended Napoleon's reign and reshaped the entire political landscape of Europe. This isn't just another battle recap. We're going to break down the strategies, the blunders, the heroism, and the sheer chaos that defined this legendary confrontation. So grab your snacks, settle in, and let's march into history. To understand Waterloo, we need to rewind just a bit. Napoleon had been the undisputed master of Europe, conquering nations and toppling monarchies with his brilliant military tactics and unwavering ambition. But by 1814, the tables had turned. A coalition of European powers had finally defeated him and exiled him to the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean. Most people thought that was the end of Napoleon's story. They were wrong. In March 1815, Napoleon pulled off one of history's most audacious comebacks. He escaped from Elba, landed in France, and in a moment that still gives me chills, his former soldiers who had been sent to arrest him instead rallied to his side. Within weeks, he was back in Paris, back in power, and ready to reclaim his empire. This period became known as the 100 Days, and it would culminate in the battle we're discussing today. But Napoleon faced a serious problem. All of Europe was mobilizing against him once again. The Seventh Coalition, led by Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, was assembling massive armies to crush him for good. Napoleon knew he couldn't fight them all at once. His only chance was to strike fast, divide his enemies, and defeat them separately before they could unite their overwhelming numbers against him. His targets were the 2 closest armies, the British-led force under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army commanded by Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. These 2 forces were positioned in present-day Belgium, and if Napoleon could destroy them quickly, he might convince the other coalition members that fighting him wasn't worth the cost. It was a desperate gamble, but Napoleon had built his legend on exactly these kinds of risks. Now let's talk about the commanders, because the personalities involved make this battle even more fascinating. Napoleon Bonaparte needs little introduction. At 45 years old, he was still considered the greatest military mind of his generation, maybe of any generation. His tactics had been studied, copied, and feared across the continent. But some historians argue he wasn't quite the same Napoleon at Waterloo. Years of campaigning had taken their toll, and he may have been suffering from various health issues that affected his judgment on that crucial day. Facing him was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, commander of the Allied army. Wellington was a defensive genius who had spent years fighting Napoleon's forces in Spain, earning victory after victory in what became known as the Peninsular War. He was methodical, cool under pressure, and absolutely unflappable in battle. His army was a mixed bag, though, a combination of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, many of whom were inexperienced or had been fighting for Napoleon just a year earlier. Wellington himself admitted it wasn't his best army, but he would make it work through sheer tactical brilliance. The third key player was Gebhard von Blücher, the 72-year-old Prussian commander. Blücher was the complete opposite of Wellington's calculated approach. He was aggressive, stubborn, and absolutely hated Napoleon with a burning passion. His troops called him Marshal forward because of his relentless attacking style. The chemistry between Wellington and Blücher would prove crucial, as their ability to coordinate and support each other would become the deciding factor in the battle. The campaign leading to Waterloo started on June 15, when Napoleon crossed into Belgium with about 128,000 troops. His plan was textbook Napoleon: use speed and surprise to drive a wedge between the British and Prussian armies, then defeat each in turn before they could help each other. Initially, the plan worked beautifully. On June 16, Napoleon split his forces. He sent Marshal with about 25,000 men to hold Wellington at Quatre Bras, while he personally led the main force against Blücher at Ligny. The Battle of Ligny was brutal, with the Prussians suffering heavy casualties, but Blücher managed to withdraw his army in relatively good order. Meanwhile, at Quatre Bras, Ney fought Wellington to a standstill but failed to destroy the British force. Napoleon had won at Ligny, but he hadn't achieved the crushing victory he needed. Here's where things started to go wrong for Napoleon. He assumed the Prussians would retreat eastward toward their supply lines, taking them out of the fight. Instead, Blücher made a gutsy decision to retreat northward, staying within supporting distance of Wellington. This single decision would doom Napoleon's campaign. On June 17, Wellington withdrew to a position he had previously scouted near the village of Waterloo, along a ridge called Mount Saint-Jean. It was perfect defensive terrain, and Wellington knew how to use it. That night, a massive thunderstorm drenched the battlefield, turning the ground into a muddy swamp. The rain would play a crucial role in the coming battle by delaying Napoleon's attack and slowing his cavalry. June 18 dawned gray and wet. Wellington's army of about 68,000 men was positioned along the ridge, with his troops largely hidden behind the crest, protected from French artillery fire. Napoleon had roughly 72,000 men, and he was confident of victory. According to witnesses, he told his officers that Wellington was a bad general and the British were bad troops, and that defeating them would be easy. This overconfidence would cost him dearly. The battle began around 11:30 in the morning, delayed by the muddy conditions that Napoleon needed to dry out for his artillery and cavalry to be effective. His plan was straightforward: pound the Allied center with artillery, then break through with infantry and cavalry assaults. To support this main attack, he ordered a diversionary assault on Hougoumont, a fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. But the attack on Hougoumont became a disaster. What was supposed to be a quick diversion turned into an all-day slugfest that sucked in thousands of French troops who accomplished basically nothing. The British and Allied defenders, though heavily outnumbered, held the position through sheer determination, tying down forces Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. The fighting there was absolutely savage, with hand-to-hand combat in the courtyards and buildings. Around 1:30 p.m., Napoleon launched his main infantry assault against Wellington's left center. D'Erlon's corps, over 16,000 men, advanced in massive columns toward the Allied line. It looked terrifying, this massive wall of French infantry marching forward with drums beating and eagles flying. But Wellington's infantry, positioned behind the ridge, waited until the French were close, then stood up and unleashed devastating volleys of musket fire. The French columns, unable to effectively return fire because of their formation, began to falter. Then Wellington played his trump card. He had positioned British heavy cavalry behind the ridge, and now he unleashed them. The Union Brigade, and Household Brigade, over 2,000 horsemen, crashed into the French columns with incredible force. The French infantry broke and ran, and the British cavalry, caught up in the excitement, charged too far. They reached the French artillery lines and were then counterattacked by French cavalry. The British heavy cavalry was virtually destroyed as an effective force, but they had shattered Napoleon's main infantry assault. This is when Napoleon noticed something alarming. To his right, he could see Prussian troops beginning to arrive on the battlefield. Blücher had kept his promise to Wellington and was marching to support him, despite his army's exhaustion and his own injuries from being trampled by cavalry at Ligny. Napoleon had to divert more and more troops to his right flank to hold off the Prussians, weakening his attacks against Wellington. Around 4 p.m. Marshal Ney, commanding Napoleon's forces facing Wellington, made a catastrophic decision. Seeing some Allied movement that he misinterpreted as a retreat, he ordered a massive French cavalry assault. Wave after wave of French horsemen, the finest cavalry in Europe, charged up the ridge into Wellington's position. It should have been devastating, but Wellington had prepared for this. His infantry formed squares, hollow rectangles bristling with bayonets that cavalry couldn't break. For hours, French cavalry charged these squares while Allied artillery tore into them. It was carnage, and it achieved nothing except destroying Napoleon's cavalry arm. As the afternoon wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate for both sides. The Prussians were arriving in larger numbers, attacking Napoleon's right flank and rear. The village of Plancenoit changed hands multiple times in vicious fighting. Napoleon had to commit his precious reserves, including elements of his Imperial Guard, just to hold back the Prussian tide. By early evening, Wellington's line was battered but holding. His center, around the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, was under immense pressure. When the French finally captured La Haye-Sainte 6:30 p.m., it seemed Wellington's line might break. French artillery moved forward and began blasting holes in the Allied infantry at close range. Wellington's army was stretched to the breaking point. Napoleon decided to make one final, desperate gamble. He would send in the Imperial Guard, his elite veterans who had never been defeated. Around 7:30 p.m., several battalions of the Middle and Old Guard began their advance up the ridge. These were Napoleon's best troops, and everyone on both sides knew that if they broke through, the battle was lost for Wellington. The Guard advanced in perfect order through the smoke and carnage. Wellington's troops watched them come, these legendary soldiers who had conquered Europe. Then, at close range, Wellington's infantry stood up and fired. The volleys were devastating. The Guards staggered, tried to continue, but British Guards units charged into them with bayonets. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke and retreated. The cry went up across the battlefield, "La Garde recule." The Guard retreats. It was psychologically shattering for the French army. If the Imperial Guard could be defeated, the battle was lost. The entire French army began to collapse. Wellington, sensing the moment, stood in his stirrups and waved his hat toward the French lines, the signal for a general advance. The Allied army surged forward. What followed was a rout. The French army disintegrated into a panicked mass fleeing south. Only the Old Guard, forming squares, conducted fighting retreats to cover Napoleon's escape, famously replying to calls for surrender with "The Guard dies, but does not surrender." By nightfall, Wellington and Blücher met on the battlefield, their combined forces having destroyed Napoleon's last army. The casualties were staggering. The French lost around 25,000 killed and wounded, plus thousands captured. The Allies lost about 22,000, and the Prussians another 7,000. The battlefield was a scene of indescribable horror, with the wounded lying among the dead in the mud and rain. For Napoleon, Waterloo was the end. He abdicated 4 days later and eventually surrendered to the British, who exiled him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, where he would die 6 years later. The Battle of Waterloo had settled the Napoleonic Wars once and for all. The Vienna peace settlement would reshape Europe into a balance of power that lasted, with some modifications, until World War I. So there you have it, the Battle of Waterloo in all its chaotic, brutal glory. It was a battle decided by multiple factors: Wellington's defensive genius, Blücher's determination to support his ally, Napoleon's uncharacteristic mistakes, the muddy ground, the heroic stands at places like Hougoumont and La Haye, Saint, and ultimately the courage of thousands of soldiers on both sides fighting in the most horrific conditions imaginable. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic battle breakdowns. Drop a comment below telling me which battle you want to see next. Should we go ancient with Alexander the Great, or maybe jump forward to the World Wars? Let me know. And remember, history isn't just about dates and names. It's about understanding the moments that shaped our world. Until next time, keep exploring the past, and I'll see you in the next video.